Welcome to A Slice with Dice, a podcast exploring the ideas, pressures, and possibilities shaping how we learn, lead, and grow. I'm Corey Alderdice. For over 20 years, my work has lived at the intersection of gifted education, leadership development, and school culture, supporting students as they find their strengths, educators as they stretch their thinking, and schools as they build pathways that expand opportunity. Ready to dive in? Here's this week's Slice. Earlier this year, I received a push notification from my son's school. It was brief and procedural, the kind of message that is clearly written for efficiency rather than comfort. It informed me that he had received a disciplinary incident earlier in the week, and that the sanction assigned was Saturday school. Okay, if you're a parent, you know what happens next. Your imagination does not wander gently. It sprints. My mind immediately jumped to all the things that might warrant that level of seriousness. And guess what? None of them were pleasant. And none of them were the things you want to discover through a text rather than a conversation. So later that afternoon, when I went to pick him up from basketball practice, I asked the question directly. What happened? He laughed immediately, which I should say did not help my demeanor. And then, still smiling, he explained that a timer alarm had gone off on his cell phone during the school day. The phone was in his bag, he thought it had been silenced, he thought it was turned off. It wasn't. And just like that, the relief set in. It wasn't a fight, it wasn't drugs or vaping or anything unsafe. It was just a ringing phone. But still, the words Saturday school lingered. Because even when you understand the infraction, that consequence carries weight. Culturally, historically, Saturday school has never been a neutral term. It has always implied something serious, something intentional, defiant, or disruptive. So even as my anxiety subsided, a different question took its place. Not what happened, but what are we really trying to do here? And that question matters because this incident didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in the context of a broader national shift around cell phone use in schools, and here in Arkansas, within the framework of the bell-to-bell, no-cell law. The expectation is now clear. Phones are restricted throughout the school day, not just discouraged, not just limited, but totally out of bounds. Arkansas is hardly alone. Across the country, legislatures are stepping into what used to be almost exclusively a local decision. Some states have implemented full bell-to-bell bans. Others have partial restrictions by grade level. And still, others require districts to adopt policies aligned with state guidance. But the trajectory is unmistakable. This is no longer just a school-by-school conversation, it's a statewide, and in many cases, I think, a national one. Now, the rationale for these policies is not hard to understand. Teachers talk about fractured attention, about competing notifications, about classrooms where learning has to fight for oxygen. Parents express concerns about distraction, social media, and the constant pull of devices that were never designed to sit quietly in a backpack for 8 hours. And much of the popular conversation has been shaped by books like The Anxious Generation, which argues that ubiquitous smartphone use has reshaped childhood and adolescence in ways that are deeply connected to rising anxiety, disengagement, and emotional fragility. So from that perspective, restricting phone access in schools feels not just reasonable, but responsible. Schools are meant to be places where attention is protected, where students are present with one another and with their teachers, and where learning is not constantly interrupted by the outside world buzzing in their pockets. And yet, knowing why a rule exists doesn't automatically settle how it should be enforced. Because policies don't just regulate behavior, they communicate values. And consequences tell stories. A ringing phone, especially one that rings unintentionally, forces us to confront a subtle but important distinction. Are we responding to distraction, or are we responding to disobedience? Are we trying to preserve learning spaces, or are we training compliance? Now, those goals overlap, but they are not identical. From an administrative standpoint, bright line rules make sense. Phones are everywhere. Intent is hard to determine. Every explanation sounds plausible. Consistency is easier to defend than discretion. And uniform consequences reduce claims of unfairness. I understand why districts would want to remove ambiguity from the system, especially in early implementation. But from a cultural standpoint, there's something worth interrogating here. When the same consequence applies to a willful violation and an accidental one, students don't experience that as clarity. They experience it as rigidity, and rigidity has a way of teaching lessons we didn't intend to teach. You see, the deeper question underneath all of this is what kind of norms we want students to internalize. Compliance-based systems work, but they work differently than trust-based ones. One produces behavior through deterrence, the other produces behavior through shared understanding. Now, neither is perfect, both have limits, but they leave very different residues behind. I keep coming back to this idea that we're not just banning phones, we're defining what school feels like. We're drawing a line around learning and saying, this space matters. That's a good thing. But how we enforce that line determines whether students experience it as protection or as punishment. So Saturday school, in that sense, becomes more than a sanction. It becomes a signal. A signal about how much grace exists in the system, about whether mistakes are part of learning or something to be eliminated, about whether the goal is presence or obedience. Now, none of this is an argument for phones in classrooms. That conversation in many ways is already settled. But the real work now is figuring out how to uphold high expectations without flattening nuance, how to be serious without being severe, and how to protect learning spaces without losing sight of the students inside of them. Now, that car ride home ended calmly. We talked about responsibility, about checking settings, about why schools are drawing these boundaries in the first place. It was, in its own small way, a productive conversation. And maybe that's the part worth holding on to. Because if a ringing phone can prompt that kind of reflection, maybe it's revealing something important. Not about technology, but about the kind of school culture we're trying to build. And I think that's a conversation worth continuing. A Slice with Dice is a production of Aldercube. Thanks for making time to reflect with me. If you're finding value in these episodes, I hope you'll subscribe and help spread the word. Until next time, lead boldly, listen closely, and keep pushing forward. I'll see you then.